All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode. Today, I'm joined by Lauren Taylor, who was with me at Wayfair back in the day, and then we formed our own startup called 3XR. But I'll let her do a quick intro. And today's topic, we're going to talk about operations with Lauren having a lot of experience in this field. I thought she's the perfect expert to help you get started with your own 3D operations.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks. Well, thank you for having me, Mike. Very, very happy to be here and especially excited to talk about something for which I do have experience in, but also am really excited to talk about and so happy to share a little bit about my background. So I joined Wayfair in 2014. Prior to that was in a number of different analytics and research roles. And I was at Wayfair for about 4.5 years, with my last 2 years there being spent on the 3D operations team. So when Mike and I were started on the team, it was only maybe a dozen people at most. And by the time we had, decided to move on from Wayfair, I think it was around 150, 200 people, including all of the different functional areas within the 3D area at Wayfair. So a really exciting time to be part of that team and under the Wayfair umbrella. And then post Wayfair, Mike had approached me and chatted. We chatted a little bit about some of the ideas he had around starting his own company, which was soon to be 3XR. And so I joined 3XR as the chief operating officer for almost 3 years. We were there for almost 3 years, and
Oh, you had a
then
good
after
run.
that, yeah, it was good. It was a lot of fun. We could talk more about that, but and then I had a few years just working fractionally as an operations leader within other software startup companies. And most recently, I joined the Lego Group here in Boston. They're moving their US headquarters here starting in May of this year. Actually, we will open our office officially,
Nice.
and I am on the Global Insights team. So, responsible for customer insights as they pertain to the US market group, as well as the other market groups within our Americas region.
Very cool. Yeah, I know Lego does a lot of interesting stuff in the 3D space, even if that's not exactly where you're focused. Um, I'm sure we'll get
Yeah.
a future conversation with some folks there to
Yes.
discuss,
And
like, how Lego utilizes 3D across the board.
yes, they really do, and I can probably give a high level summary of that. So just let me know. I'm obviously not in the day to day 3D operations within the Lego Group, but I do know some of the processes and have been in the model shop. So happy to share a bit about that if that's helpful.
Very cool. Yeah, yeah, I think we'll plug that in. But yeah, I wanted to kind of start with like our initial kind of upbringing over at Wayfair as we were building out a 3D production team effectively. I think internally at Wayfair, there was an internal interest in getting more and better imagery of product. And there were
Sure.
kind of two approaches that were being experimented with, like build out physical photo studios, kind of do things traditionally, ship product, set it up, click a picture, and then figure out the logistics. And then in parallel, we were thinking like, okay, how much does it cost to make a 3D model, and how much does it cost to make an image from that model? How many models do you actually need in the space? And so we were kind of tasked with figuring all these things out. I was in a slightly different role trying to figure out like what technologies and companies we could use to showcase those things, especially like augmented reality. And I
Yeah.
think you were a little more practically plugged into what's the ROI going to be on this? Like, how much is it going to
Mhm.
cost to get content created? Just, from that high level view, when we were thinking about that getting started, what were kind of some of the key metrics you were looking for or KPIs like around is this successful? Like, how would you measure success?
Yeah. So when we talk about cost and cost allocation with regards to what we'll call the 3D imagery process versus the traditional photography imagery process, a lot of that was looking at costs at each stage of those processes. So when you look at photography, there's a lot of costs associated with, just to start with, shipping and storing products that you want to make sure is in the photography. So some of that,
Mhm.
you have to get all the product together, the product has to be available, and you have to actually ship it to a place where it then sits and takes up space to wait to be photographed. And so lots of not only logistical costs, but also the people managing those processes. It definitely was a pretty high associated cost for that imagery. And then when you get to the next phase, which is actually the photography sessions, again, lots of logistics to manage those pieces, set up, take down, building of things to actually put them together, as well as the actual photography and production costs. Very expensive to do at scale, and also very hard from a logistics point to do at scale. So we were looking at a lot of the costs across that process and thinking, are there ways in which we can not only save cost on if you compared one photography, let's say like one photograph, apples to apples across those pieces,
Mhm.
but then the scalability factor, which you do get economies of scale once you start to actually build out 3D assets that you can then leverage to create additional 3D assets for either no cost or very
Yep.
little cost.
That's a
So,
good point.
so
Yeah, it's nonlinear,
yes,
and that's,
exactly.
maybe the photo growth is gonna be kind of pretty tied to linear, like, space and
Yes.
time and resources,
Yep.
and time is also one of those things where it's like, it could take a month or multiple months to get a
Yep.
photography process through, whereas it sounds like as
Yep.
we scale up 3D, you can both condense the time period and increase the throughput. So,
Yes. So
scalability feels yeah.
those were definitely the second two metrics that we were really focused on was time to asset development. And when I say asset, I mean photography or image, or even model, digital versus physical content. So time was a big one that we were looking at. So we were looking at how many weeks does it take, not to also just do the actual process, but to plan for it as well. So you're talking about
Mhm.
planning with our vendors to make sure that we are shipping the right product to the right space because Wayfair generally was drop shipping from partners, and so we had to get them to
Mm.
actually ship product that we needed. So when you compare the time to the 3D process, I mean, it's almost incomparable because you cut out all of that first part of the process. You're really only using digital assets, which can be sent like that versus waiting weeks for a piece of furniture to arrive. And then when you actually create the content, again, it's all done in a digital format. So the speed at which you can do that is much faster. And so we were looking at the throughput and also understanding, when you think about a lifestyle image that might have 7 to 10 products on it, that is much higher cost than if you have a silo image, which is basically, one or two products that you might be able to do more quickly, more less, less expensive. But when you look at the 3D asset sort of pipeline, there's not as big of a gap in terms of how you might be able to create that content from a timeline perspective. So really and then the last metric that we'll talk about as well is quality. So when you think about quality as it pertains to traditional photography, you're really looking at realism, you're looking at color and making sure that everything is the right color. Our partners at Wayfair were very focused on if something didn't look quite right in an image. And
Mhm.
so that I would say the other two pieces, time cost, it's very clear that that is much easier and much more
Not
effective in
as
the 3D
subjective as
vein.
something like the
Exactly.
quality or, how much does it adhere to, like, brand guidelines and, is
Yes.
it kind of presenting overall, like, the effect and the appeal that you hope it will with a customer?
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And how do you measure quality as well, right? Like when you think about traditional photography, there's a certain way in which people are looking at the images, and can you apply that to something that's done in a 3D environment in the same way? And then also when you think about how you measure impact of quality on the customer experience, we talked a lot about we obviously want to have high quality, but like where is the bar of like something being really good and good enough versus really going back and forth on maybe one little thing that needed to be
Yeah,
tweaks. But
yeah,
quality was
nitpicking all the
always,
details sometimes isn't always worth the
yes.
squeeze, like, at that point, it's
Yep.
like, "Oh, we could have, gotten 3 more done at the same time that we perfected this
Hmm.
one to get it the last, 5% of the way there."
Yeah, exactly. So I think that was probably the toughest, but also one of the greatest metrics of focus, just because it was one of the toughest and more subjective points, I would say, across our functional groups.
Excellent.
Yep.
Yeah. So that being said, like talking about the Wayfair history, obviously we both ended up leaving Wayfair right around the time where this was really ramping up. And I don't know, personally, I felt like there was a need out there in the industry. And I think like
Mm.
that was kind of our initial conversations in the 3XR days. There's how can we kind of take what we learned at Wayfair and scale that out to brands, right? The
Yep.
expectation was that a retailer like Wayfair is only going to foot the bill for so long,
Mm.
enhancing the content that is really like owned by a different brand. Like there were 10,000 suppliers or so, right? And so each of
Hmm.
those are feeding their own content into the system, and they're feeding that content into Amazon, into Target, into everywhere else. So
Hmm.
I think, I don't want to speak too much for yourself, but for myself anyway, I felt like there was an industry need in
Hmm.
education and services that could help get a brand from 0 to 100, really shorten that learning cycle and partner with them to create the 3D content that they need, and then let
Yep.
them push that content out wherever it may need to go.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot of the challenges that we struggled with at Wayfair, to be honest, were really getting everything that we needed in the right format and the right way from each vendor and partner that we worked with at Wayfair. That was definitely a big challenge. And then it was hard to get buy-in sometimes because they would give us the asset and then it's not syndicated for them, right? Like Wayfair kind of had the asset and we were using
Mhm.
it, but many of those partners also deployed content across other platforms. And so the value to them and for us getting content at Wayfair for created for them was not always as high as them potentially going directly to a third party partner who can then also provide them back with content that they can syndicate across all their platforms. So there was that. And then also exactly to your point around, Wayfair was exploring the opportunities to where they could put the cost and who was kind of taking on that burden. And
Mhm.
in order for us to be able to do that, we really needed to prove the value upstream to our vendor partners. And there were just challenges in doing that because we were using this like sole asset for what we wanted to do at Wayfair versus sharing it back. And they may have made,
Yeah.
we left in 2018, so there may have been some changes that have happened over the last almost 7 years now, six and a half
It's
years.
crazy it's been so long. Yeah.
So I'm sure there's been changes, but that was the world we lived in 2018.
Excellent. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so, all right, just switching focus a little bit. I wanted to talk a little bit about that kind of, you touched upon a little bit vendor selection, right?
Mhm.
Within, Wayfair, we worked with numerous vendors. I know even, wearing my hat at Super DNA, we're 3D modeling, vendor agency, but we're not the only ones out there. And we actually work with other agencies as well through our platform, Super DNA X. It's really kind of a spiritual successor to what we were building at 3XR,
Mhm.
content production management tool. And yeah, we're one of, many potential vendors that can use the same kind of common platform. But when you're looking to work with vendors,
Mhm.
what are some of the criteria you look into for, selecting someone to work with and how you get started there?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I hired and reviewed and spoke with so many different vendors, 3D artists across my history at Wayfair as well, 3XR. So definitely something that's very near and dear to my experience. And I think for me, the number one quality that I looked for, honestly, was not even necessarily the job that they would be doing at first. Obviously, you're getting content, you're getting the best in class like examples that they're sharing with you, right? So
Right.
that's the jumping off point. You're not getting any like terrible models that they're showing you the whole spectrum. But the things that I looked for initially were actually more like qualitative in nature in terms of when you're exploring a new channel like creating 3D content, you want a partner that's going to be collaborative with you. So you want somebody who's going to come in and say, we need to understand your business. We want to understand your business and we want to understand how you're using these assets so that we can optimize our processes that deliver the best outcome for you. And also
Yeah.
within that collaboration, we needed to have a really honest dialogues, right? Because we're building something new. This is not a very established channel for everyone, especially for brands that are just learning. And Wayfair, we were still learning how to scale this, and so we were really looking for vendors that were also really open to having that honest dialogue when things were going well, but maybe when things were not going as well. So
Mhm.
those
Yeah.
qualitative pieces were super important for me. And then obviously when you get into the quality of what they were building, we definitely had to go through usually pilot processes of kind of test and learn and making sure that they could actually scale to the point where we wanted to. And then the third thing I'll say, obviously price is a factor in all of this too. We had budgets, we had pricing. So, making sure we're in the same ballpark was important. But then the other piece was also, just making sure that we were able to be able to sync up on the right systems. So lots of times vendors and partners and Wayfair, you have your own systems and ways of doing things, right? And if you try to marry two things together that don't fit, you're not going to be able to scale that process, right? Like you're going to be
Mhm.
competing against the way in which you're measuring impact and the process steps and how things, it's going to be clunky, how things are coming out in the end. So what you're really trying to do is also find a partner that's willing to either work in the system that you had, which we had at both, 3XR and Wayfair, which, we expected our vendors to use, or we had to find ways to really figure out how we could get around some of those roadblocks if it was a partner that we really wanted to work with. So qualitative collaboration, quality, and then, the way in which we actually ways of working together were really important for us.
Yeah, no, totally. And I think you touched upon the scale a little bit too. And, just for
Hmm.
the audience, I think, the general scale we're talking is like hundreds or thousands of assets per month, right? So
Right.
like it's easy enough to
Right.
manage when you're doing an internal team and you need a couple dozen products. But when
Yep.
you're starting to do that larger scale or you have a big catalog that you're working with, um,
Hmm.
those like pieces that you're talking about, like how much work is it to export a spreadsheet that has all the data that,
Yes.
product dimensions and,
Yep.
URL reference imagery. Maybe actually let's talk a little bit about some of the inputs, right? If you're a brand
Yeah.
and you've got, product information somewhere, that
Yep.
needs to be conveyed to the modeling agency and partner. What type
Yes.
of data do you typically, look for or try to
Yeah.
get over there?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'll start off by answering also, like, high level, the model is only as good as what you input into the process,
Yeah,
right?
right.
So
Garbage
so
in and
that
garbage
was
out. Yeah.
definitely an interesting dialogue in the furniture world because you think of, like, a box, those dimensions are pretty straightforward. You think of some type of decor that has a lot of pieces and components to it, dimensions can be a little more subjective around what you're talking about.
Yeah.
So there are definitely some complexities around standardization around the expectations of inputs from the partners that you're working with that are really important, and you need to also build that trust with your customers that they are giving you the best inputs that you can get. So I will start off by just saying that, but the inputs that are important are definitely size and scale. So you want to understand what the product looks like, how big it is, and not just really three dimensional. If there's other dimensions that need to be included in there that are purposeful to your product, like if it is not, just three dimensional, there might be other dimensions included there. You want to make sure you're getting all those measurements. So that can definitely be a lift for partners if they're only used to doing, height, width, and length and things like that, and your depth. And so, you have to kind of make sure that you're aligned on all the measurements you might need. And then there's, which again might be more, then there's inputs around color and texture that are really important. And again, on any type of object, you could have multi-textured surfaces. You could have colors that, and we also struggled a lot with making sure that we had the right color specifications on our screens. Our screens looked, were set
Yeah,
up in
they
a way that we could
calibrated,
actually,
right, yeah.
exactly, the color calibration. And so the color and the textures are also a really important piece. And when I say colors, a lot of times what we were looking for were really high resolution images of colors or of pieces of the object, whatever it was. If you think about a painting, having a high res, just one square flat, that's pretty easy to do. But some of these other, if we're looking at a really intricate couch type of pattern, we definitely, and we need it to be repeatable. So if you can't have a
Yeah.
square that is just a piece of whatever the pattern is. You actually have to have a piece of the entire pattern that goes into that. And then texture definitely comes into the modeling. You want to really understand what that look and feel and actual physical feel is for a product, because that is ultimately what brings it to life, either in imagery or in a virtual environment. You want to, if it's suede, you want it to look and feel like suede from what you're
Yeah.
looking at. So that was a big piece too.
Excellent. Yeah, the technology's come a long way, and I think we continue to see, like, improvements around that kind of 3D real-time material
Yep.
spectrum, but it's always, something that we're continuing to kind of push forward and look
Yeah.
for in ways that we can kind of, somewhat make it more consistent. So,
Hmm.
one of my hats is at Kronos Group. I'm the 3D Commerce chair or vice chair, and we're basically working on, content, well, one creation guidelines. So try to make it easier for people to know what the specifications are and how to make the content, but also
Yep.
like how that can look consistent across experiences. So I'd say,
Hmm.
content creation challenge of making it look good, but then there's also the content display challenge. And I think as
Yes.
an industry, we're still making progress. We've made a lot of progress in the last, 5 years or so, but it's still an uphill battle. I think like you can't even represent all the colors that you see like in real life
Yeah.
on the screen,
Yeah.
like the three, red, green, and blue coming off our
Yep.
monitor can't necessarily authentically represent certain colors.
Yep.
And so there's always
Yep.
going to be some gaps, but I think we've made a lot of progress as an industry towards making it look pretty realistic from a customer perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think where this gets really scalable is when we have some type of I don't know what the answer or solution is to this, but a repository where you have, we talked a lot about this too, right? Like having a library of all of these consistent pieces that were either by brand, because when you think about a brand developing products, and I'll use the Lego group as an example, we're not reinventing the wheel with every single 3D asset we're creating, right? Like we're leveraging bricks that have already been created. We're then
Mhm.
applying colors. We're then applying other pieces of the model. And so when you think about if every time you're reinventing the wheel because one of our customers goes to one person to model it and then they go to another, you're reinventing the wheel. And so I feel like there's also this global library and standardization, which I know Kronos was and probably still is working on quite a bit, not only just the technology piece but also the inputs and all of the pieces that come into the process. And I think that's where this gets really exciting. And I know that's a lot of 3XR, what we talked about all the time was how do we get to that inflection point, right? Where we've got the library that is just now it's a flywheel and we're not,
Mhm.
kind of going through the clunky processes anymore.
Yeah, totally, and that's a good opportunity to maybe highlight some of the things that Lego's done. I would say as a,
Yeah.
3D first company, and the
Mm-hmm.
comparison that I make in my head, when we were in the furniture space with Wayfair was IKEA, because IKEA is kind of a
Yes.
3D first, company when it comes to product design, instruction manuals. They did a lot of AR and VR, projects at the same time.
Yep.
They were one of the first to digitize their catalog, so their physical
Yep.
print catalog most people didn't know was 3D back, in 2012 or so. And that was one of the kind of references that I think we were able to use internally at Wayfair to say,
Mm-hmm.
all right, we're not a 3D first company, but 3D is powerful and it can be
Mm-hmm.
used. So I think some of our struggle was like, how do you get that content all the way through the pipeline? But
Mm-hmm.
as a company like
Mm-hmm.
Lego, it's exciting to see that they can leverage that from design to instruction manuals to video games and movies. And I think they've
Mm-hmm.
really done a great job showing how 3D can impact not just one part of your business, but
Yes.
all the way through from design to marketing.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I think similarly to IKEA, and this is where Wayfair is differentiated, is those are brands that also own all of their inputs, right? So
Yes.
there that makes the upfront process, nothing's easy, but it definitely makes it easier when you own all of those specifications because you are actually manufacturing the products. You actually need all of those inputs to actually create the physical product of whatever you're building. So that piece, just to highlight, makes it a little easier to do that internally. Again, not an easy process in general, but yes, when you look at the Lego group, I mean, intuitively we know that through manufacturing processes, 3D is used a lot in design and a lot to figure out, how we're actually creating our next model. And when I've been in the model shop, you can see all the software they're using. There is a lot of 3D software that they're using to figure out what they're building, and without revealing too much, but there is a lot of technology that's being leveraged to be able to build and create physical assets. So it's really exciting to see. And you do see that, just with any manufacturing process, even outside of the Lego group, a lot of those pieces, and we worked with this at 3XR and at Wayfair to some extent, can hold inputs that then you're able to leverage for a lighter weight model that can then be deployed in things like we have an app where you can actually build the product. The instructions are in the app, so you don't have to have a paper book. You just have the app and you can
Good.
actually flip
Yeah.
through, and that's a 3D asset, right? That's being deployed in there that you can move around, you can see. And so that's just one use case, like way down the line to the customer experience perspective. And then there are other marketing opportunities probably that exist out there. And to be honest, not being in that world, I am maybe not even privy to how they're being used in all of the marketing spaces. But the other thing I'll say, is that we also see a lot of the big box retailers talking more and more about VR and AR, right? So there is an
Yeah.
opportunity for all brands to really be more present in store where you have limited shelf space. You don't really have a lot of room for in store activation and brand engagement, even though consumers are going there to see things and to touch them and to feel them. And so to be able to have digital components and in-store environment is going to be a differentiator. And we really haven't seen that in a Walmart or in a Target effectively and like at its full power yet. But I think once we get there, you're going to see the brands that have digitized content be front leaders and like thought leaders, and you're going to see the impact on sales once the technology is there, and it's really hit that that scale where you're seeing it everywhere now, and it's expected, right? It's not a nice to have. It's
Yep.
expected as a brand that you need to have it in store.
Totally. Yeah, I think that's one of the areas we often talked about in the 3XR days was when is it gonna go from that nice to have to, like, a requirement? And there's a
Hmm.
few, forces at work that are shifting that tide. I think, AR, VR, obviously, I've been into that space for a while, but it's still years away, and it's
Hmm.
perpetually years away. But, younger generations, they're engaging in these kind of, more metaverse experiences, and I think, the Lager Group is good at getting to where those players are.
Yep.
And kids are spending more time in sandbox games or like in Roblox,
Yes. Yes.
Fortnite, a lot of Lego
Yep.
creation tools. And so these kind of like native 3D experiences don't really fit with, like, the traditional 2D photography and inspiration. They're gonna
Yes.
expect to have, an interactive 3D thing.
Yes.
Either it may be digital for their avatar or their little house, but it might be
Hmm.
representing a physical thing that they'd wanna eventually buy, or maybe they're even
Yeah.
just buying the digital content on its own, right? That's a whole new,
Yes.
potentially better
Yes.
and greener and more sustainable way to consume
Yeah.
things, right, digitally purely.
Yeah, and one thing and yes, so thanks for bringing up the gaming piece too, because I didn't my vision is always so commercially focused, but yes, the
Well, they tie
gaming piece
together,
is
yeah.
yeah, they do tie together, and content and gaming and leveraging 3D content for that is also, a big part of our commercial strategy and how we think about success within the customer experience. But the other thing we haven't talked about really is also like the metadata that can be attached to the assets as well. So when we think about that, we used to talk about grocery and these big box stores don't necessarily have all of that digitization within store, but like imagine a world where you're walking through an aisle, and if you're looking for something specific, you can actually literally personalize and go exactly to what you are looking for because of the digital content that potentially lives in an asset that's connected to a product in the store. So when you have the metadata components attached to the digital components as well, there's an opportunity to really drive this improved customer experience because they get all the information they need. There's this thing we talk about in operations all the time too, right? Like it's not always about having all the information when you're in a fast moving environment, but you want the information that you need right at that moment that's relevant for the decision that you're making. And so 3D assets, I think, have a really incredible power behind them to potentially really revolutionize the way in which we walk through the world, which is kind of crazy to think about.
Yeah, that's really exciting. Well, we're starting to come
Yes.
up on time, so I just wanted to give you a chance for any last kind of closing thoughts, and really appreciate this discussion, and hope the audience enjoyed it as well. Feel free to add
Yeah.
comments for us to get back to you, or obviously reach out and we can be in touch.
Yeah. Yeah. No, thanks so much for having me. Always a pleasure to speak with you. So fortunate to have you as a colleague, but also as a friend. So thanks for inviting me. And this was really fun for me. Having, living more on the commercial side of the business now, it's really fun to reflect on a lot of the pieces that, are happening at Wayfair and 3XR. And it was a really, really great time, and excited to see, what you're working on, and the way in which this technology evolves. So thank you very much. Very appreciative.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining us. Thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you next time.